Good evening, Dr. Anirban Ganguly, Professor Salvatore Babones, and Ambassador Sibbal, and all of you here this evening. Very happy and honored to speak at this event today. Thanks to the Shama Prasad Mukherjee Research Foundation and Dr. Anirban for hosting today's event, and more importantly, keeping this debate going on how the world perceives and judges Indian democracy. I'm sure Ambassador Sibbal, with his long stint in diplomacy, will have a lot of wisdom to share. And I certainly don't want to steal the thunder from Professor Salvatore, who has taken Lutyens Delhi by storm in the last few days. From Kartavya Path to Khan Market, he has seen it all now. And I'm sure he'll have some piercing insights to share from all his observations. So I will limit my remarks to a few important issues that I thought I should highlight. Firstly, I want to share an anecdote on how I came to discover Dr. Babones. Some of you would recall a few weeks back, there was a column in the New York Times which talked about the death of Indian democracy. Now, the irony of that column was that very week when that author had written or got that column published in the New York Times, that author was here, perhaps a couple of streets from this location, hosting a book event to talk about death of democracy in India. So he had a very free and unfettered book tour in India to sell that book on how democracy was dying in India. So that was kind of paradoxical and ironical. So interestingly, I wrote a counter to that column on how the global media has tended to distort and misreport on India, and how, more importantly, in recent years, several instances have surfaced where geopolitically sponsored narratives have been placed either in social media or in mainstream media. And in this case, I mean, this gentleman, as even Salvatore was mentioning the other day, happens to have some very strong leanings or linkages with one of our neighbors, China, for example. The gentleman lives in Hong Kong. He's co-authored a book with another Australian professor, interestingly, on the death of democracy in India and so on. So these narratives that we are seeing have, you can't take them at face value. There's clearly a lot more going on behind the scenes there. And with the kind of hostile neighbors that we have, I think there are a lot of state-sponsored campaigns as well that are leading to these narratives. So I was pleasantly surprised when I wrote my counter column to receive a message on LinkedIn from Salvatore drawing attention to his work, which then I shared on Twitter, and of course the rest is history, and you're here in India. So I think, first of all, I would thank you for your very thought-provoking intervention, because I think that has got us all of us thinking about these indices. What your intervention highlights, and this is what I wanted to underscore as well, that the importance of solid research, a scholarly approach, and to counter these narratives. So there is no substitute for sound logic, irrefutable facts, and then this is one side of the equation. The other side is, of course, to institutionalize alternative ways of looking at these indices, these models. And I think that is where the role of think tanks, research bodies comes in. And one area where perhaps we in India have not invested enough in this kind of research, in developing a wider body of knowledge and scholarly works, so that they become the authoritative reference. Otherwise, these anti-Indian narratives that we are seeing, they end up becoming the reference point for someone who's not very familiar with India, and then tends to take these at face value. One example that I often give is creating an online repository, something like the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy, for example. A very sound, very logical, very in-depth, and with a lot of scholarly effort going into it. Build such a repository about India, Indian democracy, and all these aspects about how the new India is transforming, how India is developing. Because there's so many misconceptions. And just to give you one example, just yesterday, I happened to read this, an English translation of an essay by a Chinese scholar. And the subject of this essay was, will Mexico, Vietnam, or India replace China as a manufacturing supply chain hub? Now, the author talks of various issues that he sees with India, how India has changed in the last 8 years under the leadership of Prime Minister Modi, how the economy is transforming, and so on. But again, the author also tends to repeat some of these stereotypes, the misinformed stereotypes of India. For a long time, the world has the stereotypical perception of India being, these images of a snake charmer, of god men. And you see in this Chinese essay, that same, misinformed stereotype of, India being of a certain orientations culturally, socially, and religiously, and which is why India can't compete with China. Right. So these are the kinds of stereotypes that we will have to counter with this kind of scholarly work, with a lot of research, and bringing together an ecosystem of scholars both in India and outside India. And I think there's a great initiative that way. Because no amount of tweets, blogs, or columns will correct these perceptions. We have to put in that hard work of research, building out these think tanks and this institutional network, and create a whole knowledge base around it. So I would like to once again compliment Dr. Salvatore for his timely and thought-provoking intervention. I must also say it's a very courageous intervention, because as we can see, there's a very well-organized lobby of activists and intellectuals who have invested heavily in these anti-India narratives, and you'll soon be in the crosshairs, for the stance that you've taken. Let me just close by drawing attention to one more recent column. This one appeared in the Foreign Policy magazine, written by Ramachandra Guha, where he once again peddles the same narrative of democracy in India being under peril, and he uses the term the cult of Modi. Well, if there is a cult of Modi, I think it is because there is a guild of Guha. so if this guild of Guha were intellectually honest in their writings, there would be no need for these kinds of intervention. There would probably be no need for this event. It is the intellectual dishonesty of the guild of Guha for the past 2 decades that has manifested in these false narratives of democracy in India. So on this note, I welcome Dr. Salvatore to Delhi and India, and look forward to more interventions from him. And thank you again to the Foundation and Dr. Anirban for this opportunity.